Walnuts have been eaten for thousands of years. The Romans loved them so much they called them Jupiter's acorns, and their wrinkled, brain-like shape inspired a medieval belief that they could cure head ailments. There are two main types: English walnuts, which are the mild, common ones you find at the grocery store, and black walnuts, which are stronger, more bitter, and famously difficult to crack. Humans were eating walnuts over 8,000 years ago in Persia, making them one of the oldest foods we still eat today. Here's something surprising. Almonds aren't actually true nuts. They're the seeds of a fruit closely related to peaches and plums. Originally from the Middle East, they spread along the Silk Road and eventually became California's top agricultural export. The word almond traces back to the Greek word amygdala, which is also the name of the almond-shaped part of your brain. There are two varieties: sweet almonds, the ones we eat, and bitter almonds, which contain cyanide compounds and are toxic unless carefully processed. Spanish missionaries brought almonds to California in the 1700s, and today the state produces around 80% of the world's supply. Peanuts. Peanuts are also not nuts. They're legumes, related to beans and lentils, and they grow underground instead of on trees. Native to South America, they were cultivated by ancient peoples in Peru and Brazil over 7,000 years ago. Portuguese traders brought them to Africa, and enslaved Africans later introduced them to North America. George Washington Carver famously developed over 300 uses for peanuts in the early 1900s, helping Southern farmers diversify beyond cotton. One strange biological detail: after the peanut flower is pollinated, the stem actually bends downward and pushes the developing pod into the soil to mature underground. Cashews. Cashews grow in one of the strangest ways of any nut. They dangle from the bottom of a cashew apple, a fleshy fruit popular in Brazil, but rarely exported because it spoils so quickly. The shell surrounding the cashew contains urushiol, the same toxic oil found in poison ivy, which is why you never see cashews sold in their shells. Workers must roast and carefully remove the shells by hand, often suffering burns in the process. Cashews are native to northeastern Brazil, and Portuguese colonizers spread them to India and Africa in the 16th century. Today, Vietnam and India are the top producers. Hazelnuts. Hazelnuts, also called filberts, have been eaten since prehistoric times. There's evidence of mass consumption by Mesolithic people in Scotland. The name filbert supposedly comes from Saint Filbert, a French abbot whose feast day falls right during hazelnut harvest season. Turkey produces about 70% of the world's hazelnuts, thanks to the ideal climate along its Black Sea coast. You know Nutella. It was invented during World War II when an Italian pastry maker stretched limited cocoa supplies by mixing in hazelnuts. A single hazelnut tree can live and produce nuts for over 100 years. Pecans. Pecans are one of the few nuts actually native to North America. Indigenous peoples relied on them heavily, and the name itself comes from an Algonquin word meaning nut requiring a stone to crack. Thomas Jefferson had pecan trees planted at Monticello, and the commercial pecan industry was essentially launched in the 1880s by a Louisiana enslaved gardener named Antoine, who successfully grafted a superior variety. A year, though, he received almost no recognition in his lifetime. Today, the U.S., particularly Georgia and Texas, dominates world production. Pecan trees can live for 300 years and grow over 100 feet tall. Pistachios have been cultivated in the Middle East for at least 9,000 years and are one of the only nuts mentioned in the Bible. Legend says the Queen of Sheba hoarded the entire regional supply for herself. The nuts naturally split open as they ripen, which ancient Persians considered a symbol of good luck. They could actually hear the shells cracking open at night in the groves. In the 1930s, a Syrian immigrant named Zulum planted the first commercial pistachio orchards in California, though it took nearly 50 years for those trees to produce significant harvests. Macadamia nuts are native to Australia and named after John Macadam, a Scottish-Australian scientist, even though indigenous Australians had been eating them for thousands of years before. European arrival. They have the hardest shell of any nut, requiring over 300 pounds of pressure per square inch to crack. After an Australian businessman planted the first commercial orchards in Hawaii in the 1880s, Hawaiian macadamias became world famous. The trees take 7 to 10 years to produce their first harvest, which partly explains why they're among the most expensive nuts in the world. Brazil nuts. Brazil nuts come almost entirely from wild trees in the Amazon rainforest. The trees can live over 500 years and grow up to 160 feet tall. What makes them nearly impossible to farm is their incredibly specific pollination requirement. Only one species of large-bodied bee can pollinate the flowers, and that bee depends on a particular orchid that only grows in undisturbed rainforest. The nuts grow inside hard, coconut-like pods that can weigh up to 5 pounds. Those pods fall from the canopy and can actually kill someone if they land on you. And yes, Brazil nuts are naturally radioactive due to high radium content, though not enough to cause any harm. Pine nuts. Pine nuts have been a food staple since ancient times, used in Mediterranean cuisines as far back as ancient Rome and relied on by indigenous peoples across the American Southwest. Harvesting is incredibly labor-intensive, and workers collect pine cones from tall trees and extract the tiny seeds by hand, which is why they're so expensive. They're the traditional ingredient in Italian pesto, and some people experience pine mouth after eating certain varieties, a harmless but intensely annoying metallic taste that can last for days. Chestnuts. Chestnuts are unlike almost every other nut, low in fat and high in carbohydrates, making them more similar to a grain. They were a dietary staple across Europe and Asia for centuries, often ground into flour. The American chestnut was once one of the most dominant trees in eastern forests, making up a quarter of all hardwood trees until a fungal blight accidentally introduced from Asia wiped out nearly all of them in the early 1900s. Roasted chestnuts were once sold by street vendors across cities like New York and London. And if you forget to cut the shell before roasting, they'll explode from the steam pressure.